Alrighty, for our next panel, it's going to be a fireside chat by two amazing thought leaders. One is here locally, Seth Masket, and then Tony Mills has joined us in town from South Bend and also ties to DC. This topic, the politicization of science, is one that we felt is quite critical to discuss. Politicization is both a real thing that exists in our society. There's also some strong perceptions around politicization and polarization that are both real and perceived. And I think it's important to address what is real, what is perceived, what its impact is on how we build community. Folks in the back asking you to be a little quiet, thanks. Okay, let me do a quick introduction and pass this off to our speakers. Again, remind you, you can ask your questions about halfway through. Seth and Tony will start working them into the discussion, but they're going to have a little bit of a conversation between the two of them. So let me pass this over, but let me do a quick introduction. Full bios are in the book. Seth Masket is an amazing leader here in our state. If you have not had a chance to hear him speak or meet him, he is at the University of Denver. He's a professor in political science. He's got a couple books. One is called The Democrats, 2016 to 2020, which is already out, Learning from Loss. He has a new book forthcoming called The Elephants in the Room, How Trump Voters Seized the Party from Republican Leaders. And that one is coming out this year soon? In June, so stay tuned for that. He also has a great Substack called Tusk. And then Tony Mills has been a longtime expert in science and innovation, the relationship between scientific enterprise and democratic governance, and the ethics of science and technology. He's a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute and an associate professor of practice at the University of Notre Dame's Riley Center for Science, Technology, and Values. I am greatly looking forward to this discussion. As a little fun inspiration, there's an article that Tony wrote around the change of the administration last year that was published and really served as a lot of inspiration for this talk. It's called The Strange New Politics of Science. Things have changed since he's written that, he has shared, but there's a really good thought-provoking article. It's in Issues if you're familiar with that publication. Alrighty, thank you and enjoy this conversation.
Thank you. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you, Kristen, for that lovely introduction. Welcome to our fireside chat. I was told there'd be a fire, but that's okay. And those of you who are here from out of town, welcome to Denver. I think you'll agree Denver's lovely in the spring. Unfortunately, it's February. But I hope you enjoy your time here. So this is obviously a very fraught time for this country for many reasons, but I think a vitally important one of these reasons is the intersection of science and policy and politics. Indeed, this is an issue that stands to strongly affect us both as individuals and as a country, not just now, but for many decades to come. Certainly over the past year, but also really across a much longer time frame, we've seen scientific research come under political pressure. Federal research funds are increasingly being used as a cudgel to force political changes on university campuses and on research agendas. Expert scholarship on things like food safety, vaccines, the environment are increasingly being cast aside due to political pressures, and more. Now, that's not to say that science is usually 100% divorced from politics. Obviously, we learned a great deal from things like the Manhattan Project or the Moonshot. Those were definitely political projects, but today seems somehow different and somehow unique. I'm a social scientist. Obviously, I have some viewpoints on this, but I'm very glad for the opportunity to discuss these issues and more with an expert like Tony Mills today. I'm not really sure where we'll agree or disagree, but I think we can learn a lot from each other. So I'm going to start by asking Tony a few questions, and then we'll have a little bit of a dialogue here. So, Tony, attitudes towards science, confidence in scientific findings and acceptance of scholarly research. This is one of the defining fault lines in U.S. politics today. I'm curious, how did we get to a point where acceptance of scientific findings is determined by our partisanship? I know you've been writing on this topic. I'm wondering if you can just give us a little bit of insight on this.
Sure. And let me just begin by saying thank you to the Institute for the invitation to be here. It's rather daunting to follow Ponch, so it's a real honor to be here. And actually to be sandwiched between Ponch and the governor. So I really sort of wonder why I'm even on this stage, but I'm very, very grateful.
We're filler, but yeah.
We're filler, exactly. And thank you in particular to Monty and Susanna for their hospitality. It's wonderful to be in Denver. So I think to answer the question how we got where we are, it's worth saying a bit about where we are, and maybe even where we were in, say, November 2024, before Donald Trump returned to the White House. Maybe a little background framing here. There has been an ongoing debate about a crisis of trust in science now for some time. And it's important, I think, to contextualize this by recognizing that based on survey data, public confidence in science in the United States historically has been quite high and fairly stable, and remains actually quite high. The majority of Americans express a high degree of confidence in scientists and scientific institutions. This is compared to confidence in Congress, media, low bars here, but the difference is quite stark, right? So we've seen sort of secular declines of institutional trust since the early 80s, and science has been surprisingly stable. And this is to the point that prior to COVID, the debate among scholars was there really a crisis? There was a lot of concern growing about politicization, about a crisis of trust. And I would say a kind of predominant view was, let's not get over our skis here. Things are really not all that bad. I was in the minority view in that debate, saying that we really do have a problem here. And I think after COVID, we can now see that we do, right? And so since 2020, we've seen significant declines of trust. Still, again, relative to the low bars I mentioned, confidence remains relatively high, but things get pretty complicated when you go beyond those top level survey data numbers. And I think if you just look around the country and you look at our politics, it's no surprise to say that we have an issue here of public attitudes towards science and scientists and the way that that's impacted our politics. So really since 2020, we've seen a kind of shift. I think something that's come out of that that's very important is the polarization of trust. So we've seen overall declines. So the numbers that I have, we did a survey at AEI in 2023, and Pew and the General Social Survey have also done this and found similar things, that from 2020, the percentage of Americans that expressed a great deal or some confidence in scientists to act in the public's best interest was around 86%, which is quite high. It declined to around 69% after COVID-19. So that's overall. If you then look by party, it's really striking. So Democrats, pre-COVID, 91% expressed that level of confidence. After COVID, it went down to 82. For Republicans, it started at 82 and went down to 56. Right. So coming out of COVID, we have 56% of Republicans versus 82% of Democrats. This is very striking. So if you go back and you look in the 1970s, maybe we can talk about this more later, this was a moment, I think, too often forgotten, when we had lots of concern about science, a kind of crisis of trust. If you look at the survey data we had then, not quite as reliable, the data on declines were way smaller than what we see here. And it provoked a kind of national conversation about a crisis of trust. So that's where we are. So we are seeing declines, and we are seeing a polarization of trust. And I think what I try to argue in the piece that was mentioned earlier is that we're actually entering a new kind of paradigm where attitudes towards scientists and scientific institutions has become a kind of axis, a dividing line in our social and political life. And it's one that is interacting with, in kind of problematic and disquieting ways, a lot of other kinds of polarization that we're seeing. So I feel like I've been talking for too long. I haven't even gotten to your question, which is, how did we get here? Maybe I'll pause for a minute.
Thank you for all that. Well, actually, I wanted to ask, this is related to this. Do you see similar times in our nation's history where scientific expertise has been called into widespread question or has been subject to intense pressure from elected officials like this?
Yes. Short answer is yes. I think sometimes when we talk about this issue, we take 1945, 1950 as our baseline. And there's a lot of good reasons for that. We were hearing just earlier about the creation of the National Science Foundation. There was a huge sort of institution building effort during and after World War II, and there was high degrees of trust in scientists. And we can point to the Manhattan Project and the Apollo mission, these successful missions. And so we think of this as the kind of golden age of science and of federal science. And there's a lot of truth to that. I think if you go back farther in history, we'll find that the mobilization of science by the state has always often been in response to crisis, like World War or outbreaks of disease, and has often engendered lots of political controversy. Political controversies that are very similar to the ones we're seeing today. You can go all the way back to the 1880s, and you can find Congress asking questions about whether federal science then conducted in bureaus like the Geological Survey was constitutional. Was it a worthwhile investment? Was it geared toward outcomes? Could we measure the impacts? Questions that are very familiar. If you fast forward then to the 70s, which is, I think, as I said before, sometimes too often overlooked, this golden age of science really came into a kind of crisis of legitimacy. The term legitimation crisis was popularized in the 1970s to describe what was happening with welfare states across the West, with federal scientific institutions in the United States. We see a kind of collapse of confidence. And maybe we could talk a bit more about that, the causes and the response to that. But I think it's helpful to just remind ourselves that what we're experiencing now is not entirely without precedent. And I think it's helpful because it allows us to be somewhat sober-eyed about what we should expect going forward. We think positively about the Apollo mission, for example. But the Apollo mission was quite controversial even at the time. A lot of people made the case, well, we shouldn't be diverting resources away from social problems here on planet Earth. Why are we trying to get to the moon, right? This is a very controversial issue. We tend not to remember the controversy now because it was such an astonishing feat. But I think it doesn't necessarily give us answers about what to do today, but it is helpful context to remember that these periods of relative tranquility or equilibrium are punctuated by these moments of crisis historically.
I wanted to ask you something, and this is overlaps a bit with what Punch was talking about earlier, which is the degree to which science should be pushing back. Just to relate a brief story, I had a fellowship at Vanderbilt last year. I went to observe a rally for science in early 2025 at the state capitol in Nashville. And there were a bunch of, medical researchers, chemists, physicists, who were pretty clear this was their first protest. And they were so sincere, and they had these wonderful, they were like, what do we want? Peer review. When do we want it? 6 to 8 weeks. And my impression is they've gotten better. They're doing more. But in your opinion, should they be focusing on their research and let that speak for itself? Should they be trying to organize? Are they any good at that?
Yeah. Judging by the reaction in the audience, I think we know the answer to your last question, maybe. I think, so science is unavoidably political. I think that statement can be taken too far and misinterpreted, but there's no question, since the middle of the 20th century, arguably going back before that, science operates in a political context. It's dependent on federal support. We know that very clearly nowadays when those tools are being weaponized for political reasons. So there's a sense in which even if most scientists day to day may not be advising presidents and so forth, their work is situated in a social and political context. And many scientists themselves, or people who are trained in science, do go on to have careers that are not being research scientists. And I think this is maybe a bit of a sidebar here, but I think that we don't do a great job preparing people who are trained in the sciences for careers beyond research. There is a real kind of expertise and a set of moral responsibilities that are unique to the advisory role, to policy roles that a lot of scientists have. And I think in general, not to overgeneralize, scientists are not that great at it. There are real counter-exceptions. We just heard from a great exception to this just a few minutes ago. But I think we saw during COVID the what's at stake and not really thinking through and preparing scientists for the responsibilities that many of them have when they're public facing. But I think your question actually picks up on a really thorny issue, though, which is, what should scientists do in this current moment? Is the responsibility to use their position to be more engaged in politics? Is it to be less engaged in politics? I think the challenge here is that we don't really agree as a country about the answer to that question. And I don't have the data here, but I spent a lot of time in right of center circles, and if you ask people on the right, why don't people trust science? Why don't you trust science? What's gone wrong with science? The number one answer I guarantee you'll hear is politicization. Science has been politicized. And if that, we can talk in a second about whether that's true or fair, but if that's the perception, having scientists going out and protesting and engaging in politics in a kind of partisan advocacy type way is not obviously going to help that problem, right? So I don't say that even normatively, just this is a kind of reality that I think we have to think through. And I do think maybe this sort of gets into the how we got where we are piece. I think one of the prevailing explanations for how we got where we are on the right side is politicization. And I think that there are some data points there, or maybe more anecdotes that we can point to in favor of that kind of explanation. The prevalence of scientific organizations and scientific publications endorsing presidential candidates, and they're not Republicans. This goes back decades, but editorials in leading science magazines, science journals that are very critical of one party, very favorable toward another party, taking positions publicly on controversial issues. If you don't agree with those issues, you are, first of all, much more heightened to the fact that there is politics happening here. If there are things that you tend to agree with, you tend to not notice them maybe as much. But there is this argument, Dan Sarowitz, a science policy expert, was making this case 20 years ago, that to the extent that the scientific enterprise presents itself as an arm of the Democratic Party — Dan, by the way, is not a conservative or Republican — to the extent that the scientific enterprise presents itself as an arm of the Democratic Party, it will harm itself. It will be seen as political, and it will not have the broad legitimacy and support that we all know very clearly now it requires to be successful. So that's the sort of politicization argument. Now, I actually think that argument is very limited. I think there are deeper things going on here. Maybe we can get into that. But I think it's an important thing to keep in mind when we think about the question of what scientists should do. I think we have to have a prior argument about what is the role of scientists, because I think we'll find that we don't actually agree on that. Sure. Yeah. So we're thinking about these sort of the causal sort of issues. I mean, causal is a tricky word in social science, but how did we get where we are? And one of the things that really interests me is trying to link the questions around trust in science to some of the broader phenomena that we all know around polarization, around trust. And so this is really the piece that was alluded to before. Part of what we were trying to do is situate the data that we have on trust in science in the context of what political scientists and social scientists have been studying now for quite a long time, where we're seeing real changes in our parties and our coalitions, the rise of populism. So this is really more your area than my area. So I'm sort of interloping into that. But I'd love to ask you what you see as the key changes in our politics, and to what extent these can help explain what we're seeing with science.
I mean, there's a lot of change going on there.
Yeah.
It's a very big question. This is actually somewhat tied to my current book research, which spends a lot of time talking about a rising populist movement over the last 3 decades or so. And we've had, populism, which we might call just like an intense distrust of elites, a lot of, questioning of scientific consensus, questioning of basically whoever is in charge. Going back, these things crop up all throughout American history. But particularly since the late 80s, early 90s, the presidential candidacies of Pat Buchanan, in some ways, the rise of Fox News and other media, certainly Newt Gingrich. There were a lot of changes going on long before Donald Trump ever became remotely interested in running for office. That's part of it, and that's sort of rising, really, and particularly on the right, it is part of it. Another part of it is, we talk a lot about white working class voters and how their patterns have changed in recent decades. Partially, that is due to the erosion of labor unions. You had a large group of, relatively, non-college educated whites who generally voted pretty Democratic for many years, in part because, some of them were in the South. It was parts just sort of a Civil War history to that. In the North, it was due, a lot of them were unionized and were being pressured leftward with that. With those changes sort of going away, you have a large segment of the population that is increasingly being drawn to the right. And it has that kind of anti-elite value to it. Donald Trump, he didn't invent that, but he definitely has capitalized on that, and he's sown more of that distrust, and has really encouraged conspiratorial thinking in those ways.
Yes, this brings up an issue that I think is really important and maybe not fully as central to the conversation as it ought to be, which is the polarization of our country on educational attainment, the diploma divide, right, which was much discussed coming out of the November election. And so one of the arguments that I've made, so another explanation for eroding trust, polarizing trust, is that sort of prevailing in the scholarly literature is political or partisan ideology. The argument runs roughly as follows: conservatives dislike government, and their dislike of government has spilled over in dislike of science. There's more, I can kind of elaborate on what that argument is. That's sort of what it boils down to. I find this argument to be very inadequate, and one of the reasons for this is that the ideologies of the parties have really changed, first of all, but also that what we're seeing as one of the biggest predictors of attitudes towards science is level of educational attainment. And this is happening at a moment when our parties are sorting by that metric as well. And so this, to me, seems like the real story, that we're seeing a kind of pulling apart of our country around education and all of the implications that has. And that's happening politically. And it's not really that surprising that this would have impacts on public attitudes towards science. But how do you see this education divide relating to these broader changes? Obviously, this is something that in some ways goes a long way back, but really feels novel in its importance in some ways too.
Yeah, your question touches on a lot of stuff that I really care very much about. One of them is, as you point out, the ideology question remains problematic for us because we tend to think of ideology as this fixed thing, right? We have this idea of what liberalism means and what conservatism means, and it turns out they're kind of malleable. That conservatism means whatever conservatives decide it means. So, in some surveys I've done, if you ask Republicans, the ones who most strongly identify as conservatives are also the ones who most strongly identify with Donald Trump. And yet he is a departure from what we used to think of conservatism 10 or 20 years ago. So there's that going on. But yeah, part of those changes that I was just describing have a lot to do with this diploma divide. For a very long time, kind of the least educated voters tended to vote Democratic, along with a smattering of folks in the professions and people, with PhDs. And that has been shifting, particularly among white voters, just in the last few elections, where now, majority uneducated whites or not college-educated whites are now trending to the Republican side. Yeah, and that has an enormous difference. That's because, how you campaign among those folks and how you appeal to them just changes a lot. And we have this unusual situation where essentially, both the wealthiest and the least wealthy whites, the most educated and least educated whites are now trending on the Republican side, and Democrats are sort of catching the middle, which can work. I mean, the parties are still very closely divided in terms of government control. But I think probably the most important thing is that these definitions are in flux right now.
Yeah.
These alliances are in flux.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting to me. So putting some numbers on this, we found in our survey, it's sometimes this is the way that this is reported. You could probably speak to the technicalities here more than I can. But if you look at survey data on college-educated Americans, Republicans, and their attitudes about science or whatever else, there's a question about what we mean by educated. And so we found in our data, if you looked at whether you've attended some college or not, or you have sort of some college or less education versus a college degree or higher, the extent to which your education level predicts your attitude in science is not that great. But if you look at Americans that have a high school degree or less, have a college degree or higher, the gap is enormous. So nationally, between regardless of party, is 84 to 56%. And this was an answer to the question that I mentioned earlier: do you trust scientists to act in the best interest of the country? Within Democrats, it's 94 to 65. So within the Democratic Party, educational level is a huge predictor of your attitude towards science. Within Republican Party, it was 70 to 49. So that tells me that educational attainment is huge. It's hugely important. The other factor was religion. We haven't talked as much about that either. And so I think those two factors seem quite important. And there is a lot of data on how religious identity interacts with political identity and how the parties have changed in that way. There was some some work that's shown that over time the two parties have kind of switched actually on whether religious identity and attitudes towards science kind of sort you in one versus the other. And so I think that there are these larger shifts happening. And I guess I want to ask you, my sense is that we're kind of entering something of a new paradigm here, that our kind of traditional conceptual mental models for thinking about our political divides, our attitudes towards institutions aren't really adequate to the moment. But I wonder if you agree.
I think we've gotten used to a lot of stasis in politics for a while, and things being pretty predictable, and they're just far less so right now. Oh, you had mentioned something about education. I'm blanking on the specific question.
The divide between within the parties and also religion.
Oh, yeah. One of the interesting changes in religion and politics, if you look at, I'm a big fan of the American National Election Studies, supported by federal funding for many years. These go back to the 1950s. And if you look at surveys in the 1950s and 60s, what denomination you were of Christianity tended to predict a lot of your party behavior, whether you were Lutheran or Episcopalian, or whether you were Catholic, whether you were Jewish. That you could tell a lot about a person, how they were going to vote by that. A lot of those distinctions have been erased in more recent decades, and it's simply how often you go to church or temple. Your religious frequency becomes a much better predictor of your partisanship than it used to be. And that is all shifting right now. You have the rise of a very conservative evangelical right that has also really stood out among other religions as being very strong. That's part of the changes that we're talking about, is that the rise of that as a major political force in the last 20 or 30 years. So we're not really sure what this is all going to look like 10 or 20 years from now. There's I hate to keep bringing him up, but Donald Trump exerts a lot of influence over the current political system. He will not always be there. And what the parties look like...
Hard to imagine, but...
I know. It's
true.
He'll have a long shadow, but at some point, things will look different. And there's a lot of question as to certainly what the Republican Party looks like after him. Whether it continues to sort of move in his direction. I don't think we're going to see it snap back to a Reagan-Bush coalition anytime soon. But the fact that if you looked at the Republican presidential primaries in early 2024, where Nikki Haley was getting 30 to 40% of the vote in some contests, those were all from voters who knew Donald Trump was going to get the nomination. But they felt they wanted to make some statement. They wanted to stand up for something. And those folks are going to be part of this conversation later on. I don't know that they're winning, but I think they have more of a voice than they used to.
One thing I think that we haven't talked about as much is the changing makeup or perceived makeup of the scientific community. And so something that I think is pretty striking here is, and you mentioned white evangelicals, we found that they're the least trusting of science group measured. And the most trusting were unaffiliated Americans. So the most secularized and white evangelicals were kind of the two poles. White evangelicals are also the least, or among the least represented religious groups within the scientific enterprise. And there's a lot of research done on this sort of the secularization of the scientific enterprise, certainly the perception of its secularization and perception that science and religion are in conflict, and so that there's a kind of culture clash there. And then there are questions about the sort of political attitudes of scientists and to what extent non-scientists are responding to those. There's a often cited study that's 20 years ago, maybe more, that found something like 6% of scientists are registered Republicans. As I said before, they certainly don't present very Republican. And so kind of reality and appearance may not matter ultimately that much. So I'm wondering how much this plays a role as well. And what do we kind of know about this, and how should we think about the institutions of science themselves, not just how the non-scientists and their coalitions are changing?
Yeah, I mean, this is a stereotype, but like a lot of stereotypes, there's something to it, right? That that academia has become quite left-leaning, and there's a lot more complexity to that than generally gets much attention. Yes, if you go onto a lot of college campuses, you'll find a lot of professors lean left. particularly in the social sciences and the arts and humanities. That's not as true in the hard sciences. It's not as true in business schools. But you know, in a lot of places that get a lot of attention, yeah, those folks are pretty far to the left. Now, some of that, the question is, well, how did they get to that point? Was there a purge of conservatives? I don't think there was. But somehow, you know, once an industry gets a reputation for being a place that just one party hangs out, that tends to perpetuate itself over time. And conservatives with a scientific leaning just say, maybe that isn't for me. So it becomes hard to erase that. So then the question is, well, you know, how much is academia responsible for that? Some of it has just happened, but it also contributes to what we're talking about, this educational divide. I want to turn to, we're getting some questions from our audience, and I want to be sure to give them a little bit of time there. So if you don't mind, I'll ask you one of these. What advice would you give to future lawmakers and policy experts to help bridge partisan gaps in science distrust?
That's a very important and very hard question to answer. Yeah, so this maybe is not an answer, maybe more of a identification of the problems that have to be solved in order to answer it. I think, and it's connected actually to our conversation. I think something that's happened that's novel is that, and I think it's connected to the politics of higher education, that areas of science that were previously somewhat insulated from partisanship are now very much at the heart of our politicization and our politics. I think you see that with the current administration, what's happened with the National Institutes of Health, the National Science Foundation, which was historically very, had lots of bipartisan support, has not been spared a lot of the changes, to put it euphemistically, that have happened in the past year. And this really does seem like an important change, that we had kind of background consensus of the importance of federal funding of basic scientific research in universities predominantly. And I think part of what we're seeing is that the spillover of the backlash against higher ed is spilling over onto areas of science that are sort of odd candidates in a way for politicization, because they do tend to be more politically moderate and so forth, and have had historical support. So I think that's kind of the background context of where we are in lots of ways. But a related problem here is that to the extent that the scientific enterprise is being coded politically, it creates a kind of human capital problem. And I sort of see this, I'm getting to an answer here. I see this in like very front row in working in policy, that it can be difficult to recruit people who are either right of center or are comfortable working with people on the right of center who work in science policy. There just aren't nearly as many of them as there are people on the left. And so this percolates up into the federal government. The current administration, for various reasons, has had challenges recruiting and staffing up in a lot of key areas. The issue of expert capacity in government is longstanding, but it's very acute, especially right now on the right. So one answer to the question is, you need more conservatives, you need more Republicans in science policy. I think there's no answer to the question that doesn't involve that. If the scientific enterprise is perceived because in some ways it has become a partisan exercise, then the divide is just unbridgeable. I don't think we can have a universe in which science is entirely outside of politics and just perceived as neutral. We need to have a kind of broad base of support and human talent that can be drawn on in order to begin dealing with these kinds of questions. But that's a difficult problem, because it's very upstream in a lot of ways from our politics. So I don't have a ready-made answer to it, but it's a very important question.
Yeah, I think one of the things I was really heartened to learn about was these ISP fellows in the state legislature.
Yeah, likewise.
Where to help bring a level of familiarity with scientific terms and concepts and research to elected officials. And this is one area where I think we've agreed scientists themselves are not always great at advocating for their work, but elected officials should be.
Yeah.
And to the extent that they're gaining this scientific literacy through programs like that, I think that's a very positive thing.
And this is sort of your territory, but this is a really big problem in Congress, and it predates Trump. We used to have an Office of Technology Assessment. There's a general retreat of expert capacity in Congress. In the natural sciences, but also beyond that. And that's a place where I think, it's part of a larger issue of trying to reform Congress, but I think it's a very important one.
I could go, how are we on? Okay, great.
The governor's coming. So you either going to go about 10 more minutes, then they're going to have the governor come on, schedule, and then we'll go to break.
Great.
Great.
All right.
Okay. Okay. Great. Well, you're with us for the ride. Okay. um, yeah, there were. If you remember back watching TV in the '90s, when you had like that NBC must-see TV, and you had Friends, and Seinfeld, and ER, and there was something in between those that was just good enough to keep you from changing the channel. So we've gotten a couple of interesting questions along the same lines here. So yeah.
So one of the ones that caught my eye had to do about communication. And I wonder what you thought about this question. Like, what can scientists, people in politics do to communicate better? This connects up to the talk we heard earlier. I sort of have my views about this, but I thought that would be worthwhile to think about. Like, to what extent communication strategy is part of the solution to the problems we're talking about?
Yeah, I think about this a lot in my own field in political science and a lot of the social sciences. In medical research, there's a lot of intermediaries, right? There are people who are just really working in labs and trying to publish papers, and there are a lot of journalists and bloggers and others whose job it is essentially to explain medical research and to make it seem more digestible. Now, sometimes important nuances are missed, sometimes things are oversimplified, but there's a way that research can be translated for the public. That's less true in some of the hard sciences. It's really a problematic area for a lot of the social sciences. I've gotten, some of the work I've gotten involved in sort of public-facing research, my Substack newsletter, some major publications were running like political science blogs for a while. We're looking for ways for people to be able to translate what's going on and help people understand, just what the research is that we do. I remember, and again, this is pre-Trump. This was back in the early 2010s. I think it was Senator Jeff Flake and a few others were questioning why the National Science Foundation should be supporting political science research, and just saying they were just kind of laughing at it. It was a punchline to them. And then they lose office, and it's like, oh, everything all right with politics now? But there weren't enough people who were able to articulate, okay, well, we're trying to understand public opinion. We're trying to understand some of the topics we've talked about today, how religion impacts our votes, or how education is shifting in terms of political alliances. And if you think that politics is going great, fine. Yeah, we don't need research in it. But most people don't think that. And there should be some people who are able to explain that. So I'm a big advocate for that.
Yeah. So I think maybe, I don't know if it's a disagreement, but a slightly different way of thinking about this. To my mind, communication is absolutely essential. I think it's something that happens whether it's intentional or not. I think we saw this very clearly during COVID, when a lot of experts were engaging in expert disagreement on Twitter, for example, right? Which is a kind of public medium of a certain kind, right? So there are really, I think, challenging questions about how scientific information is in fact communicated to a broader public. But I think that and I think, as I said before, that there is a set of skills and responsibilities that are unique to public-facing roles that we don't often do a good job preparing scientists for. But I also think that there is a bit of a danger or a trap that scientific institutions can fall into, which is the thinking that trust is purely a communications problem. And this is connected to a kind of another prevailing explanation of what the causes of distrust and polarization, which in the literature they call the deficit model, that just the public has a deficit of information, and we just have to pour more information into that gap, and that will make them trust us. And I think this is a view that has absolutely no support in the scholarly literature. It's widely discredited, but it is extremely pervasive in public-facing institutions. And I think for obvious reasons, because they're well-positioned to do communication. And so it would be nice to think that could solve the problem. But one of the things that I think I want to sort of convey in our conversation here is the extent to which trust is a relational concept. And if trust is broken, it needs to be repaired. It doesn't need more information. And so communication is absolutely essential, but I think there are deeper questions about how our institutions are functioning, who is in them, who is representing them, that we have to address simultaneously, or communication skills will be kind of a false solution.
Thank you. Yeah, I know. I do agree with that, and it makes me wonder because it is possible to take some of this communication stuff too far and maybe over democratize science to the point, like you point out, that we're arguing about the best ways to deal with a massive, deadly pandemic on Twitter.
Yep.
And under 138 characters or whatever. Obviously, a lot of things can be missed that way. And there was a comment, I think, by Vice President Vance recently, where he was talking about scientific research and just saying what you do, and the way science works is if you disagree with the finding, you challenge it and you get up and you publicly disagree with it, and then the best result of the debate will be the truth. That's not remotely how scientific research works, but that is a much more populist view of it, that we can simply challenge things and have a debate about it all the time, when that's not really remotely what scientific research is. So there's a question here tied to what we were just talking about. I just throw that at you. To what extent is the politicization of science the result of scientists engaging in policy and politics versus politicians seeing science as bad?
Yeah. Yeah, so this is a really tricky one. This is kind of what I was alluding to before. I think the argument that the public attitudes are explained by the politicization of science is worth taking seriously. I think it is not taken seriously enough by folks on the left and a lot of expert institutions, but I think that it also misses something really important. So I tend to see this a little bit differently, which is that we are seeing the effects of the polarization of our country across a range of lines, right? Educational, attainment, religion, and party. And I think the concern I have, what I think is a more helpful explanatory framework, is that the values that scientific institutions project, to some extent embody, and by which I don't just mean sort of scientific values of whatever the kind of classical norms of science are, but they're sort of the larger social kinds of values, relationship between science and religion, attitudes about certain policy issues and so forth. These increasingly look and feel disconnected from the values of a lot of Americans who are increasingly voting Republican. There is a just kind of value divergence here. And I don't think it's because these institutions are all highly politicized necessarily or producing bad science, right? But if an institution is predominantly populated by people that tend to think a certain way, that is going to shape how they situate themselves, the kinds of problems that they identify, the kinds of things that they want to emphasize, the things they won't be sensitive to fault lines that exist within a different kind of worldview. And I think you can sort of see this pulling apart. So the argument that I made in this piece, we were talking about this a bit before we came on, is that it's actually a really interesting question why people trust large expert systems at all, right? From a sociological standpoint, most people actually don't know practicing scientists, most Americans. Most people, of course, are not themselves scientists, but they may not even know scientists interpersonally. And social trust is traditionally established by face-to-face interaction. Most people have connection to expert institutions through things like their visit with their primary care physician. And so the sociologist Anthony Giddens has this idea that our trust in these large institutions to be sustained has to be re-embedded into face-to-face interactions with experts who sort of stand in for those large systems and institutions. So your primary care physician isn't just your doctor, she's also a representative of the medical establishment in a certain way. And if trust isn't sustained at that point, that access point, or if it's broken at that access point, the trust can become systemic. The distrust can become systemic. And what we proposed in this paper is that re-embedding of trust in face-to-face interactions is failing. And it might be failing for a number of different reasons. But I think one of them is that increasingly lots of Americans look at expert institutions, medical, scientific, or whatever, and they don't see themselves represented there. They just don't see their values represented there. And I think this is a deeper explanation, arguably, for the polarization effect than crude politicization or something like that.
Can I ask, do we have time for one more? Okay. One that I wanted to ask you. So arguably, and I'm curious if your history agrees with this. 1950s, the Red Scare. You had folks like Senator Joe McCarthy and others kind of demonizing scientists, accusing them of being communists, or just sort of mocking them as eggheads. It was kind of like not the peak intellectual moment for the country. And what turned that around was Sputnik, 1957. It was just a widespread recognition that, oh, there's an important thing going on and we might be losing. Suddenly, scientists were very much in supply. The federal government was very generous with universities. They were hiring up researchers all over the place. Do you see the prospects for a Sputnik moment today? What would or could that look like?
Yeah, so it's interesting. I think the McCarthy era is also an important data point because, again, in that really high level history, we had World War II, totalitarianism was defeated by American science, and everything was great until we've fallen into crisis. We had the 50s. We had this moment that had a lot of parallels with, say, we had the 70s. So we really have seen these moments throughout. So it's interesting. I think in a way, we've had shocks, right? We had COVID. We arguably AI, the geopolitical competition with China. We have lots of important, large-scale global things that have happened that one might have thought, and some people did think at the beginning of COVID, would engender a kind of Sputnik-like moment. It's interesting to think about Operation Warp Speed, right? So we had COVID, we had this incredible, I think the most successful project of industry and research, certainly in the 21st century, but arguably, we have to go back to the moon landing or World War II to identify a tremendous success like that, right? The ability to develop and deploy vaccines that quickly. So in a sense, that was our Sputnik moment, right? But we all know what happened to our politics since then, right? So we've become even more divided. So I started to notice this, especially in policy circles and in scientific circles. There's this almost, I don't want to say a desire for a crisis, but this feeling that if we had a crisis, well, now that we've gutted our public health institutions, we're going to have a crisis, and that's going to bring us all together. I think that we should learn from recent history that crises can lead to social dissolution just as much as the reverse. And something about our politics right now seems to incline more in that direction. So I don't see that at the moment as a really viable option. And I think COVID and some of what's going on now geopolitically are pretty good counterexamples. Maybe we'll have an even bigger crisis, next year, and I'll be proved totally wrong. But I don't put my hope in it.
I think that's a very good answer. Should we? Yeah. Okay. Well, let's go back to our audience. Let's see. We've heard a lot about political threats against good science. What about political support for bad science or pseudoscience? Is that the same problem? Is that a different one?
Political support. Yeah. Well, so I think we've, in a lot of our conversation, have been talking about kind of the context pre-November 2024. We're now entering in a very different kind of moment. And I think, like I said before, that a lot of our tools for grappling with these questions are not really adequate. I think that's even more true today than it was even a year ago. So I think one of the big differences here, the kind of elephant in the room, we have someone in charge of the Department of Health and Human Services who has views that were, well, the anecdote that I think is very illustrative is 2 months before the election, there was a public debate going on about whether scientists and doctors should platform for the purposes of debate RFK Jr., and he's now in charge of HHS. So that's how different the moment is now, right? And so the changes that are happening at some of those agencies has raised a question about the reliability, the trustworthiness of the science, the research, and the information coming out of our federal agencies in a way that I don't want to say has no precedent, but maybe has close to no precedent. And so, yeah, I don't have an answer to this, right? I think we are kind of now moving into a zone where the traditional gatekeepers of our knowledge-producing institutions, the traditional functioning of those, is not even in question. In some ways, we're kind of moving into a very different world, and it's very disorienting. And in a certain sense, it's hard to see this as not connected to a larger shift away from print culture, that a lot of these institutions are being disintermediated. The norms are changing. So we were talking about AI earlier. If you look at how AI research happens, a lot of it happens in strange online forums. There are norms that crop up that are entirely native to the digital universe that govern how research is done there, all operating outside of the traditional peer review system. Right. So there are, I think, really important questions being raised now in a very acute way about what norms these institutions have, what they should be, how should they adapt. And I don't have an answer. I don't know. Maybe you do.
I don't, but No, but I mean, another example of this, I was thinking about last summer when the head of the Labor Bureau of Statistics got fired.
Yeah, perfect
right?
example. Yeah.
Simply for producing data that the president didn't like.
Yeah.
And that, that was a moment, and then that sort of passed on like everything else. But I think that is emblematic of a way bigger problem that's also much harder to pull ourselves out of.
Yeah.
Because, from that point on in the future, people are always going to be a little more suspect of numbers that come out on the economy when that was considered, one of the most reliable indicators in the world about a major economy.
So there's two things I just want to add to that. One, I think, sometimes when we talk about trust, it's whether people trust scientists, right? People don't just not trust anything, right? So if people stop trusting the CDC, they'll place their trust somewhere else, right? So the question is, who is being trusted? And I think part of what we're seeing is that established institutions are no longer can no longer take for granted that they are the sort of the default trusted institution. But then we have the second problem that those institutions may be changed in ways that are engendering distrust, like the CDC. And I think what's happening with the second Trump administration, which again, not novel, but in some ways, and added to the other dynamics we have, is a very dangerous kind of brew, which is distrust of the scientific community and of the broader public, of the federal scientific institutions themselves. So we have breaches of trust now kind of going in every direction, and this is quite disquieting.
So I guess in conclusion, we need to invent Sputnik. Did we decide on that? Okay. Well, I want to thank you so much for this conversation.
Yeah,
this has
likewise.
been great, and thank you all for your questions, for listening in.